Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today I'd like to provide a guide for students studying Aesop's Fables, and I'm going to provide a reading and commentary on Aesop's fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. The birds, the beasts, and the bat. So, as we normally do, we'll take a look at the text that we study in the Aesop's Fables course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We'll read through it, and then we'll talk about the characters and some of the details. Then we'll identify, or at least reflect on some moral lessons that can be drawn from the fable, and talk about how it might apply to our lives. Remember, when we study these fables, there's not necessarily one right answer. We've seen in our study of past fables how if we look at different characters in the fable, look at them from different perspectives and so on, we can come up with lots of really helpful moral lessons from these fables. So there's not just one simple answer for the fables. There's quite a bit that can be drawn from them if you reflect on them. And as students get more intelligent and wiser over time, they're able to see and think about more and more, especially as they gain more experience in life. And whether it's a young child or an elderly man, Aesop's fables are a great source of study and reflection for the sake of moral philosophy. So let me read through this fable, and then we'll work through it, make sure we are aware of all the details, and then talk about some morals and their applications. Again, this is Aesop's Fable of the Birds, the Beasts, and the Bat. Once upon a time, Aesop writes, a fierce war was waged between the birds and the beasts. The bat at first fought on the side of the birds. But later on in the day, the tide of battle ran so much in favor of the beasts that he changed over and fought on the other side. Owing mainly, however, to the admirable conduct and courage of the eagle, the tide once more and finally turned in favor of the birds. The bat, to save his life and escape the shame of falling into the hands of his deserted friends, fled, and has ever since skulked in caves and hollow trees, coming out only in the dusk when the birds are gone to roost. This is the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. So first off, as we consider the characters in the fable, we see that there's a war between two sides, birds and beasts. We then see the bat introduced as a third character, but we also see the eagle introduced as a fourth character. So not only do we have the birds as a group or class, but we've got the eagle in particular spoken of here in the fable. So we've got the birds, the beasts, the bat, and the eagle. So we've got four different characters, as it were, in the fable. Now, the reason why the bat is significant, I don't know if you have bats where you live. We certainly have bats here in North Carolina where we live. Bats are strange creatures because they fly, so they're usually associated with birds, but at the same time, we know they're not like birds. In fact, they're very different from birds. They have no feathers, first of all. They have feet, unlike birds, even though birds have, like talons, like an eagle would have talons, more like claws. The bats have feet. The bats are covered with skin, no feathers, and even more importantly, bats don't lay eggs. They reproduce more like mice. They give birth to living offspring, so they're viviparous. So they're not like birds. The only thing they have in common with birds is that they fly. They're really a flying animal. So they're sort of an in-between creature. They're like birds, but they're also like beasts. So if a war breaks out between the birds and the beasts, the bat is sort of stuck in the middle, left to figure out which side he really belongs on. And what the bat does is he chooses a side. And at first, we're told he chose to fight on the side of the birds. So his first judgment was that the birds would likely win, or he could say, well, I'm a bird, so I'm like a bird more than like a beast, so I should fight with the birds. But whether he did that because of his nature being similar to the birds, or because he expected that the birds would win, he chose to fight on the side of the birds. But as the battle went on, he started to notice that it appeared that the beasts had the upper hand, and so he decided to change over and take the side of the beasts. So we see here the character of the bat. All right? We see this character of the bat. Doesn't really fit into either class, and he chooses the side that he thinks will bring him benefits. So he's a shady character at best. Good for neither the birds nor the beasts, stuck in the middle, as it were. And then Aesop draws our attention to the eagle. And I think when we look at the eagle in this fable, it helps to draw out what Aesop's message really is. He says, owing mainly to the admirable conduct and courage of the eagle, the tide once more and finally turned in favor of the birds. So we had something of an even battle going on between the birds and the beasts, but there was one character in particular, the eagle, that really forced the result by his admirable conduct and courage. So we're presented with the eagle as the most significant player in this battle here. He's admirable and courageous, and he actually forces the event to work out in his favor. And we've got this clear contrast between the eagle and the bat. And this helps us to understand the character of the bat. It's one thing to say that the bat, doesn't fit in necessarily on either side and he's stuck in the middle. Well, that's true, but what this teaches us is you've got to choose a side, and once you choose a side, you've got to fight for that side. You can't hold back and sort of wait to see the outcome and go back and forth, because the person or the animal in this case that goes back and forth, he ends up being left in a state of shame. And that's what we find the bat, to save his life and to escape the shame of falling into the hands of the birds after they ended up winning. He fled from the battle and hid in the darkness, hid in the shadows, as it were, and has ever since skulked in caves and hollow trees, coming out only in the dusk when the birds are gone to roost. So we've got this clear contrast between the behavior of the bat and that of the eagle. And again, Aesop focused our attention on one virtue of the eagle, and it was the eagle's courage, right? The eagle's courage. Whereas the bat is looking to save his life and ends up skulking about in caves and hollow trees, having to hide for the rest of his life. The eagle, wins the day. And it's no coincidence that, in America, the eagle is sort of the symbol in our American traditions. The eagle is the symbol of freedom. It's used very often as a symbol of America, this sort of nation where we live with freedom and courage, right? That's what the eagle represents. We see this big, powerful bird flying high in the sky, sort of the king of the air. That's what the eagle represents. And we see that character of the eagle in this fable here. And the eagle is shown to us as an example of admirable conduct. And the bat is shown to us as this shameful, skulking creature that doesn't fit anywhere and ends up hiding in caves and trees. And so he's sort of a dishonorable character. And that's the moral of this. That's the moral of this fable, I think. The principal moral is that courage and commitment brings admiration. And we see that in the eagle. Courage and commitment brings admiration. And this lack of commitment and fear for one's own life leads to shame. So we have the bat as a symbol of this cowardly, self-preserving personality that ends up being left in shame, as opposed to the eagle, which stands strong for his side, fights with courage, and gains the admiration of all of the beasts. So we're inspired by this fable to be like the eagle and not to be like the bat. So that's the story of the fable with its details. And as we look at the moral is to fight courageously. To take a side in these battles that we face in life, to choose what side we're on, and to fight courageously for that side. And when we look at this fight between the birds and the beasts, the outcome was uncertain. The outcome, it wasn't clear who was going to win. It was going back and forth throughout the day. But the eagle, through his courage and perseverance, kept fighting, and in the end was responsible for the successful outcome for the birds. And he's held up to us as a model. But you see that commitment and courage and perseverance, all of these virtues on display in the eagle, and their opposite vices, all seen in the bat. The bat is indecisive. He's trying to. He's a fair-weathered fan. He's sort of trying to figure out who's going to win, so he can side with that group that's likely to win. And then he ends up, fleeing and hiding, and he spends, the rest of his life as a creature that has to hide and skulk about in caves and trees in the dark after the birds have gone to roost. So we've got this clear moral lesson to take up a side, to be courageous, and to fight for that side. I think that's a clear moral lesson here. It's not so much, looking at yourself like the bat and trying to figure out which side should I fight for. It's taking the side that you want to win, and then fighting for that side. And fighting with a resolution of your will, and a courage and perseverance that's willing to fight to the end. To think about your fellows rather than yourself, and to be willing even to risk your own life and safety, risk the loss of everything for the good of your friends in this case. So how does this moral apply to our life? What sort of applications can we think of? Well, as Christians, it's pretty clear. There's a war being waged between God's people and God's enemies. And it's important for us to understand that that's used in a way to illustrate, because our desire is that God's enemies would be converted and become God's people. But in the present, at the moment, we've often got to deal with this war that's being fought between people seeking to honor and obey God and glorify God, who love God, and those who despise God, who do not fear God, who do not love God, who are immoral, who have all kinds of problems in the way they think and act, and they have inordinate desires, and they're unjust, they're vicious people. And there's always this war going on between these two sides, especially at the spiritual level, between God and his people, the church, and all of the forces of evil that work against God's will in the world. And we've got to pick a side. We can't be like the bat and say, well, I'm kind of like these people. I like to do some of the things they do, but I'm also, sort of like God's people because I like some of the things that they say. We can't flip-flop between these two sides. We've got to pick a side. And it doesn't really matter if we look at ourselves and say, well, which side am I more like as I am? That's really not the way to answer that question. The right way to answer that question is, which side do I want to win? And which side should I fight for? Which side should I fight for? And then once I make that resolution to be willing to fight for that side with my life, to be willing to die for that side that I fight for. And it's that spirit of courage, the courage of the eagle, that fights on behalf of the side of God's people. That's really what makes us to imitate the saints. When we look at the saints, we see that God leads them through their own individual life, and by his grace, he prepares them for the ultimate sacrifices in life where they have to choose and be willing to suffer out of love for him, suffer the loss of anything, suffer the loss of everything, because they love God so truly and perfectly that they don't consider anything else worth saving, even their own life. And we can see the eagle in this fable is sort of a symbol of that character of the courageous, persevering Christian who fears no dangers, fears no troubles, just as Jesus taught us to live. Christ himself, being an example of a man who most perfectly models the character and behavior of this eagle in Aesop's Fables. And we've got to be careful that we don't sit there and, we have this phrase in English, sitting on the fence, not choosing one side or the other, having one foot on one side, one foot on the other, not committing. That's a vicious character. That's a cowardly character. That's not a virtuous character. That's not an honorable or admirable character. That's a shameful character. And think about what happens when children or adults choose to sort of flop between two sides in life. They end up living like the bat. That's how they live. They end up skulking about in caves and hollow trees, spiritually speaking. They don't live with the courage of the eagle. Think about the eagle. He's out in the open skies in the middle of the day, flying about, perched on the highest places in full view because he's courageous and he's got a clear conscience, speaking morally, allegorically of the eagle. He's like a righteous man. He's like the righteous man. In fact, Proverbs says that the righteous man is bold like a lion, compares him to a lion, talks about the boldness of a righteous man. And the reason why the righteous man is bold is because he has a clear conscience. And he's detached from all worldly things. And because of his virtue and wisdom, he's willing to sacrifice his life for the sake of what's right. And he lives with a knowledge of his sincere intentions and resolution. And that gives him courage and takes away all fear. Jesus says to us, do not fear him who can kill the body. Jesus tells us that if we have a right disposition, if we think rightly about life, we won't be afraid of someone who threatens to kill our body, much less take away our stuff or put us in prison or beat us up whatever it may be, we won't fear that kind of a thing, because our love for God and our desire to fight for God's people will be our only concern, and that will lead us to true courage and courageous behavior. Whereas to flip-flop and not commit and be subject to wimpy worldly lusts and desires, and to be cowardly, to be afraid to go against the grain, to go afraid to say no to people, to be afraid to speak about spiritual things because we don't want someone else to say. That's the life of the bat, a shameful, cowardly life. If you want to live like that, go ahead. Go skulk about in the caves and in the hollows of trees. Go hide all day when the other birds, when all of the brave and courageous Christians are out and about standing in public. You can wait and hide in the shadows until they all go away, and then you can slither out or sneak out like this bat coming out of the cave as the sun goes down. Because you can't go about freely like God's people can go about, who have clear consciences and are afraid of nothing. So that shows us this character of the eagle and the bird. And this is precisely what we're taught in the scriptures. I mentioned that proverb before, that the righteous are bold like lions. On the other side, the proverb says, the wicked man flees when no one pursues him. In other words, his guilty conscience, his sense of shame, causes him to always be afraid. And you can see this in sinful people, especially sinful kids. When kids are sneaky, when they cheat, when they lie, when they steal, when they don't do what they're supposed to do. Let's say you're working on your computer and your mother says work on your lesson, and instead you start fooling around, and then when mom comes in the room, you have to hurry up and try to change your screen and close out the windows, because what that behavior does in your soul, in your life, is it makes you a coward. You're gaining, you're growing in cowardice. You're afraid. You're looking around. You're worried about who's looking, who's coming in the room. Does that sound like the behavior of this eagle? No, it's not the behavior of the eagle. That's the shameful, cowardly behavior of the bat. And you just see that habit of lying and sneaking or stealing and trying to hide things, and that's not a virtuous character. That's not how a strong person lives. That's not honest. That's not courageous. That's not admirable. And what that does is, while you're doing that sneaking and all, you're developing in yourself the habit of a shameful, cowardly person, afraid of getting in trouble, afraid of getting caught. And for all this tough guy talk that we hear among sinful people, they're not the tough guys. They might talk tough when they're surrounded by younger, wimpier people, but they're not the kind of people who die virtuously and risk their lives to save others and do other virtuous works in life. It's the righteous who are bold as lions. They're the ones who do the heroic tasks in life. So if you think about Gollum in Lord of the Rings, he's like the bat in this story, right? Cowardly, hiding in the caves, lurking around, sneaking around. And why? Because he's trying to hide this ring, right? Trying to hold on to this evil and live in sin, and it destroys him, and it turns him into a character like this bat. So we can see that moral lesson in this fable. There's a battle, there's a war being waged between these two sides. The bat has to choose a side, but he doesn't choose a side. He sort of waffles between the two sides and then ends up getting caught on the wrong side. And so now, having to suffer the consequences of his lack of resolution and courage, he ends up having to flee to try to save himself. And he spends the rest of his life hiding in the caves and the hollow trees, unable to come out and stand in the light like the eagle. That's the fable of the birds, the beasts, and the bat. So I hope that that's helpful. I think that not only identifies the moral of the story for us, but also helps us to think about its application. You know, we've got to choose a side that we're going to fight on. There's no middle ground in this fight. We've got to choose a side, and you know which side is the right side, the side that promotes virtue and courage and righteousness and holiness and honesty. Obviously, that's the side that you should fight on. So there's no excuse for why you're flip-flopping and choosing which side you're going to fight for. And once you make that decision to fight for the side of God's people, you've got to go all in. You've got to be willing to lose everything for the sake of helping that side win this battle. Because if you don't give everything you have, if you don't fight as hard as you can, that's what gives the enemy the opportunity to win, or at least win on that day when you're fighting. So you've got to choose a side. You know which side you should choose, but the question is, do you have the courage and the prudence to choose the right side and be willing to fight as you should? Now, it's humanly impossible to do this. It's humanly impossible to choose the right side and be willing to fight unto the death. Humanly impossible, but that's what God's grace allows us to do. God's grace gives us the courage and strength, gives us the hope and faith that we need, and most importantly, gives us love for God, which is ultimately what causes saints to be willing to die for the faith. It's their love for God. It's charity. Those things, faith, hope, and charity, they come from God. You can't get them. You can't go to school and get faith, hope, and charity. Your parents can't give you faith, hope, and charity. They can give you them sort of in seed form through baptism. And they can also help you to attain them and grow in them by introducing you to the sacraments and by teaching you the Catholic faith. But you've got to desire them. You've got to want to be strong like the eagle. You've got to have that desire to be wise and virtuous and strong and honorable like the eagle. And in order to become that, you don't just turn to your own ability. You've got to beg God. You've got to pray that God would give you the grace that you need to do those things, because that's the ultimate test of our will. When we face a challenge that we can't overcome by ourselves, we can either quit and just say, well, I'm not strong enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not courageous enough. We can make excuses based on our own human weaknesses. Or we can still remain committed and pray for God's grace to strengthen us in those areas where we're weak, so that we can actually do things with the help of God's grace that go above and beyond anything that's human or natural. That's the whole point of the Christian life, is to live by grace. So our weakness should simply lead us to pray, not to quit, not to make excuses, but to pray that God would give us the grace that we need, the faith, hope, and charity that we need to be able to live like the eagle and fight courageously on his behalf, for his name's sake, for his glory. So I hope that that's helpful. If you have any questions about this fable, please ask. You can ask on the student forums. If you have more of a personal question, you can send me an email, and I'd be happy to chat with you about the fable. But I hope that that's a helpful guide in your first reading of the fable. What I recommend is, once you've watched this video and get these ideas in your head, go and submit the assignment. Complete the assignment and get it turned in so you can get credit for it while all of this is fresh in your head. And keep going, because there are 400 of these fables in the Academy's Aesop's Fables course. So get this one done. God bless.